Welcome to the CEC Report. It's June 22nd, I'm Robert Barwick, and I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, first, Greeks vote, but the collapse goes on. The CEC prepares for 0 hour of total financial collapse. And finally, Rio+20 Summit is a celebration of mass extinction. So first, the Greeks vote, but the collapse goes on. This week has been an extraordinary week in the financial system. Bookending this week, you had at the beginning, on Monday, enormous sighs of relief around the world as the Greeks voted right, Craig. They did the right thing. They've saved us all.
For the next 5 minutes.
Next 5 minutes. Well, it was good while it lasted. I'm sure a lot of people, you know, their blood pressure went down by a few points maybe. Because what we were told is that they voted for the pro-austerity parties in Greece to win a majority of seats, and that sent relief through the financial markets.
But the fix was put in, Robbie. I mean, look, we were putting out a press release last week internationally to say that with a combination of Greece and Spain, that we were at the edge of the entire system collapsing. So this was just like, you know, a toothpick holding up a cement slab in terms of what's coming down.
The fix was in, plus it wasn't true. And that's the key thing here, which we've actually issued a statement on. I want to talk about what has also bookended this week, though, because it's been a big week. Overnight, the US financial markets have gone into a massive meltdown. So the relief from the beginning of the week has already turned into massive financial panic as of the end of the week. It's happening now as we speak, and so today's markets in Australia are expected to be in meltdown as well. What's this about the fix? The Greeks did not vote for the austerity parties. What do you think they are? Stupid? And I was particularly disgusted with the media because it doesn't take much to explain that the majority didn't vote for the austerity parties, but there was a certain electoral mechanism that allowed the austerity parties to claim the most seats.
But Robbie, they're part of the fix too. It's not just as though the media is an independent organ. It's not. And you have to look at what's happening in England, for example, under Rupert Murdoch and the spying, the phone tapping allegations and so forth. And if you have a look down here, you know, you look at the various way the media operates down here, you see that, you know, it's part of the international financial organ, actually.
Well, look at, and for the viewer, they can figure it out for themselves. Look at what you weren't told. 55% of Greeks voted against austerity. A clear majority. That's a landslide.
But that's how parliamentary systems work, Robbie. The majority never get in.
Well, that's a good point too. The Greeks have a certain rule though, Craig, that the party that gets the single highest vote, not a majority, just the highest, gets a bonus of 50 seats. So there's 300 seats in the Greek parliament. One of the austerity...
hang on, this is the birthplace of democracy, Robbie.
Yeah, something's happened.
And they're chucking in a freebie, a 50-seat freebie.
They're chucking in 50 seats for people who don't exist, basically. So New Democracy, which was the conservative
it's a very new
austerity
democracy
party,
in my book.
Well, there you go. It's like
why not have 100 seats?
New Labour or what's his name? George Orwell's 1984 New Speak is New Democracy in that vein. I think it probably is. They got 30%. The main anti-austerity party, Syriza, got 27%. That's the margin of error statistically. That's virtually no difference. But that 3% extra gives New Democracy an extra 50 seats. So between that and the other single pro-austerity party, PASIC, they can get something like 160 of the 300 seats and a small majority, and then they can vote. They can govern. But here's the problem. All the Greek population know the way they voted. It will be impossible for this new Greek government to actually govern. That's why they're trying to beg this Syriza party to join them, and the Syriza party is refusing to because they know it'll be suicide if they do it. But here's the ridiculous thing of the whole thing. All the relief we felt that we were told to feel this week because of this outcome, Greece is no longer the issue, Craig. It's as of a few weeks ago, the crisis has moved on already to Spain and now Italy, and they are a much bigger problem for the euro than Greece ever was.
So the spring in my step just dropped out, Robbie.
I think that's probably what you'll find has happened. Go back to your podiatrist. Last week, Spanish bonds were at 6.9%. This week, they jumped up to 7.3%. Last week, Italian bonds were 5.3%. This week they jumped up to 6.06%. These are sharp rises in days. And what that means is the investors that all governments need to have people constantly buying their bonds so they can pay their bills, etc., because they're all in massive debt.
Yeah,
but no one's buying.
Under a debt basis.
They're running away. Spain is the 4th largest member of the euro. Italy is the 3rd largest member. Now, while this was going on, you had the G20 meeting. The G20 turned out to be an absolute farce. Julia Gillard lectured everybody, and no one wanted to listen. She told them to, copy Australia and you'll be right. What are they supposed to do? Run home and dig for iron ore? I mean, what did we do that was so great? Anyway, the European members fought each other, and here's the key thing. They put out this statement that affirmed that what they need is not just austerity but growth. But Craig, when they say growth, they don't mean physical growth. They mean Keynesian financial growth. Now, I'm going to talk about this in a minute, because they're actually opposed to physical growth. And so by financial growth, they mean justified more money printing. And then overnight, in terms of what causes market meltdown, Moody's has come out and downgraded 15 of the biggest banks in the world, including JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, HSBC, Barclays and Deutsche Bank. They've downgraded because they said, look, the state of the world economy is such that these banks are not going to be anywhere near as profitable as they were. And of course, all these banks have their own debt obligations, and if they're not getting the profits in that they previously were, then that's going to be harder for them to service. So Moody's, in a sense, is not doing this to play funny buggers. They're forced to, by the rules of accounting, they're forced to do this. But a downgrade means that the money that those banks try and borrow automatically goes up in terms of interest rate, right? And so we've had, from a week that we were told was one of great relief at the beginning, it's turned into an absolute mess. Craig, where I want you to talk about though, this week it was exposed by LaRouche and the EIR people in America that in 2009, 2010, Barack Obama's point man to reform the global financial system after the big GFC, Paul Volcker, was actually actively working behind the scenes to stop any return to Glass-Steagall, which was an overwhelming motivation at the time. And so we now know that. Isn't that the reason that we have had this mess this week?
Well, Robbie, look, Paul Volcker, who is this guy for most of our listeners? Paul Volcker was the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the 70s and the 80s. Now, I know him pretty well because I had a small business back in that period. It was 19, 20%, 22% interest rates on overdrafts and things like that. He presided over the policy of controlled disintegration of the economy, which spread, in particularly in the US, but it spread globally.
That term, controlled disintegration, that was their term.
That was their term. So who did Barack Obama bring in? He brings in an asset of the British Empire, Paul Volcker, to oversee the so-called reform of the banking system. And what LaRouche has found out last week is that he is basically running a call-up campaign to all of the various lower House of Representatives members, Congress people, to get them to support his Volcker rules, which is part of the legislation that's going up before the Congress in July, I believe, in order to so-called control the banks. But what he's doing is actually letting the banks off the $2 trillion that they are in debt for, and they're basically demanding or making sure that the American taxpayer bails out that $2 trillion. Now, we're proposing Glass-Steagall, which is basically going to wipe out that debt. The Wall Street guys can head back and they can take that debt back. And if it sinks, well, so be it. But Paul Volcker is saying, and specifically, we, under the Volcker rule, don't have to punish the banks. So when people are going to see their savings disappear, their livelihood disappear, their retirement pension funds disappear, they're doing it to protect the banks. And it's not a matter of punishing the banks. The banks are responsible, and the policies for the policies that have caused this misery in the first place.
Because of course, what Glass-Steagall would do is, as you said, make the banks eat their own losses, but separate out from them that part of banking that relates to the real economy. Yeah. So that's protected. That's not going to suffer as a result of this. It's the speculative cowboys that are going to suffer.
What I find interesting is the Volcker rule basically says you can't do things like proprietary trading any more banks. You can't take your own funds, speculate on them against your customers, in a sense. We had a bit of this here in Australia where I think it was Goldman Sachs or one of those entities that were selling CDOs were actually recommending one form of derivative, right, but actually themselves backing themselves against the customer. It was absolutely criminal what they were doing. This is the sort of thing that the Volcker rules will so-called control. That's not the issue. The issue is, what do you do with the debt? And we're saying under Glass-Steagall, you simply write it off. You protect the good debt, that is the debts that are associated with the necessity of supporting the physical economy. The rest of it, you just park it. Park it for 100 years, you know, let the banks eat those losses.
Yep. So there you go, people. We've been harping on about Glass-Steagall for a reason. And if you want to keep having weeks like this, keep supporting the current system. If you want to solve it, let's go with Glass-Steagall. So we'll leave it there. On the other side of the break, we're going to talk about how the CEC prepares for 0 hour of total financial collapse. Welcome back to the CEC Report. The CEC prepares for 0 hour of total financial collapse. Last weekend, following the publication of our latest New Citizen, which we talked about last week, the CEC held a series of very important meetings all around Australia in capital cities with CEC activists to anticipate what actions must be taken in the event of a total financial collapse. Now, such a collapse is something that people are in denial about, but don't be. The question discussed at these meetings was, at 0 hour, what do we do when called upon by the government to direct the response to the crisis? How serious can it get? Well, for example, in Greece right now, food and medicines are in short supply. And in the case of very important medicines for cancer, etc., they're not available at all. There's nursing homes that have run out of food entirely, and they're begging people to help them, etc. This is what happens in an economic collapse. The only thing that stands between Australia and Greece is China. And if you remember back to 2008, just in the months after the GFC, showed you how quickly China can grind to a halt. Because unfortunately for China, it's got some excellent economic developments going on, but it's got a reliance on the West, which makes it very vulnerable, and it can grind to a halt overnight, which is what happened back in 2008. When that happened, all world shipping ground to a halt. Australia's exports to China stopped completely. Government revenues here collapsed, and governments had to go on a borrowing spree, etc. It happened very, very fast, and it was only China's stimulus at the time, Craig, that kick-started China and kick-started us again. Kevin Rudd's $900 stimulus did nothing.
Bought a lot of plasma TVs, I believe.
Yeah, from China. But the point is, the economy is physical, and it becomes a physical crisis. What we have is physical processes of food and production, etc., that are totally at the mercy of the financial system, and it's the financial system which is going to collapse. So this is something that governments have to be anticipating. Craig, we're the only ones in Australia who are. We can't talk about it in a lot of detail, but what is the principle that must be applied at such a time if a crisis which is coming is going to be solved?
Well, Robbie, just to state it at the outset, this is the principle of the common good or the general welfare of the population first and foremost, where the government goes away from being just a satrapy for the banking system and says we're there to respond to the needs of the population first and foremost, and everything else is actually irrelevant. What I want to put on the table for people is that, you know, back in 2008, we can remember the words, we could not foresee the global financial crisis. It was said by Julia Gillard. It was said by the finance minister at the time, Lindsay Tanner. If
people watch our homeowners and bank protection bill
video, we see them say
opens with those words.
So that was a complete lie. We were forecasting this for years in advance because we're looking at the collapse of the physical economy. The other thing, Robbie, is that just in the last couple of weeks, Goldman Sachs lost $2 billion almost overnight, just evaporated. And this was supposedly after all the new controls have been put on under the post-global financial period of 2007.
Sorry, you mean JP Morgan?
JP Morgan, sorry, not Goldman Sachs. So consequently, you know, when people say that this can't happen, they're in fairyland. We're in the process of a disintegration right now, and at any point, something can happen where the entire banking system, you go to the ATM, there's no money. Now, at that point, you're going to have panic in a very short period of time unless the government is literally on television saying, we stand for the general welfare of the population, and comes up with concrete measures in order to protect the welfare of the people. Now, we have the benefit, we have a gentleman that's been working with us for over 10 years, Robbie, that actually was he was in Iraq in the 1990s when actually Iraq disintegrated after the First Gulf War. And what he made, the comments were very, very important, so he has a hands-on sense of what actually happens. Now, he was talking about meetings of 100 or so people. And the interesting thing is that those people usually are in families. They've got kids, they've got relatives, they've got elderly people to concern themselves with. So they're not interested in anything except hearing the truth. And he reported that when there's a lot of chatter and so forth, but when someone stood up and actually said something that was truthful and sensible, the people listened. Now, we've had discussions amongst ourselves, and the first thing that happens is chaos. No, it's not. The first thing that happens is, or must happen, to avoid the chaos, is you have a clear program to say, okay, our population needs this. It needs a banking system which needs to be supported. It needs food that needs to be delivered and got to the supermarkets. It needs fuel. It needs utilities. We need water. We need electricity. So all those things the government steps in, protects and makes in a very short period of time stable.
And the common good principle is that all those things now are covered, sort of totally under the authority of a market mechanism, a free market mechanism, and the government has to cut through all that, irrespective of laws or whatever, cut through all that to make sure that those services are delivered first, and then they can work out the other details later.
That's an important thing. Money is an idiot, Robbie, because it's a means of exchange, but unfortunately on a monetarist system it's given an implicit value. So money itself is traded. Right, this proprietary stuff with the banks, they use their own credits and stuff. It's the same thing. Money's given a value. If we face, and when we face a disintegration of the system, the only thing that's going to disappear is the money. The physical services, the potential to generate power, to supply gas, to produce food and everything is still going to be there. So you have to harness whatever it takes necessary to keep those processes functioning.
And the population cannot accept anything less. They cannot accept a government saying, no, we can't intervene in that area. Because right now the Greeks are being, they've been told to vote for rules where the government says we can't break these financial rules to deliver you medicines. You can't tolerate that.
No, it's going to kill people.
The people have to force the government to do the right thing.
And that means there's a lot of people are going to be very uncomfortable about what has to take place. But if they want to eat, they want to survive, then you can no longer tolerate these financial monetarist system that we've had.
Yep. All right. So this is the beginning of a discussion process that we will be continuing, and so we'll report as we go along here. But this is what people have to have at the top of their mind. And of course, the ultimate solution, Craig, is you can't anticipate every single thing that has to be done. You want to have the right people in the right positions to make who will think through what has to be done, and that's us. Right?
No one else has even bothered to start thinking about this in a serious way.
Exactly. All right. When we return, we're going to talk about the Rio Summit that's just started in Rio de Janeiro. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, the Rio+20 Summit is a celebration of mass extinction. 20 years on from the original Rio Earth Summit, it's on again in Rio de Janeiro. And I want to raise a point that I mentioned earlier. This summit coincided the same week as the G20 Summit in Mexico, Los Cabos in Mexico. And so it's the coincidence of these summits that proved to you when they were talking in Mexico about growth, they don't mean physical growth, because all those yahoos were about to go to Rio for this summit and sign on to shutting down any physical growth, shutting down the world's productive capacity. We're going there, everyone else is going there. The single best thing said about it that we've seen so far has come from the government of Argentina, which is fiercely protective of its sovereignty. And what happened this week is that Argentine Planning Ministry Under Secretary of Planning and Environment Policy, Silvia Rivera, told the June 20 Vientitris magazine today that, quote, "We're headed toward a trade war," end quote, because of what developed nations are demanding in terms of green economy, and that behind this very concept, quote, are a variety of different traps. She rejected the idea of some form of global governance for environment policy as a ploy to pass on the cost of dealing with environmental damage to developing countries. Quote, our concept of sustainable development implies distribution of wealth and includes the whole range of social, economic and environmental policies defined by a country. That's why we say no to the imposition of a green economy and yes to sovereign development, in which we control our resources on the basis of our reality, end quote. And then she warned that several European and other nations want to violate the sovereignty of developing countries, by which she means the British, Argentina's
they know that very well
favourite country,
Falklands, yes,
and obstruct their development through such ruses as imposition of carbon taxes or demanding that countries certify how much carbon was used in the production of certain goods. This is absurd, she said. We can't compete with this nonsense and we are hurt by it, she stated. So that's the Argentine government. By contrast, our government, Julia Gillard and Tony Burke, is keen to get over to Rio to do what? To boast about how we have just locked down 50% of our waters into marine reserves, which is bad enough, but it means that a full half of all the world's marine reserves, Craig, are now in Australia. Mm-hmm. We have half of them, and we're pushing all our fishing industries to extinction, etc. So this is bizarre. Craig, you know, here's the irony. In terms of this summit, tell the audience, what species is in the most danger of extinction?
Well, it's not fishes, obviously, Robbie.
It's not fishes.
It's us. Because if we've got the goods on this, in our last New Citizen we've just published, we have a special section on there which summarises a larger review that we've done before, exposing the nature of the World Wildlife Fund, also the Australian Conservation Foundation, which is committed as a direct organ, not just a side organ, but a direct organ of the British Empire, the British Crown in this particular case, for population reduction, of reducing the world's population, as they have stated, from the 7 billion we are now down to the 1 billion that they want to see. And all these things like Rio and these various other green conferences, and I can remember the first one 20 years ago because the CEC had only just started back then, about 4 years.
We ran a massive mobilisation against it at the time.
Yes, and the point is that you know, we actually had interventions here in Melbourne to various people that were part of the Rio conference. I can remember that very clearly. They were very boisterous. We had members thrown out of meetings.
I think I was turfed out of a meeting.
You were turfed out of a meeting
about the Rio Summit.
Yeah, because the point is that this is genocide. We stated it very, very clearly. And that's what people have to understand. Anything green, Robbie, is actually just a front for genocide. It's not that you don't have policies to protect the environment where they are necessary, but they're not done so for the exclusion of human potential development, which is what you know, Sylvia Rivora was talking about, is that the issue and principle of national sovereignty comes first. It's up to countries to determine how they're going to use the resources within that country for the benefit of their people, first and foremost. Whereas, of course, as we know, the British Empire is looking at a world government scenario of looking at having world parliamentarians. That's what Bob Brown is going off to become part of the world parliamentarians. You know, this guy is, you know, green to the boots, or brown to the bootstrap, actually. And the issue here is global austerity, global fascism, and population reduction.
Yep. All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. So that's it for this week's CEC report. Let me reiterate that we have a newly circulating New Citizen newspaper, and it's very important that people get bulk copies and keep that distribution, expand it very rapidly. Australians need to read this now, and you can see with the subject of today's CEC report how urgent that is. And that means you get involved with us and make this happen. This is not just a news service, it's a call to arms. So thanks for that. Tune in next week for more.